7 days. That was how long James Whitfield had been sitting on the same bench at Ponce City Market before the woman with the food cart stopped in front of him and changed the rest of his life, though he would not understand that part until much later. At 4 in the afternoon, the plaza had its own rhythm. The after-work crowd was still an hour away. The lunch rush was long gone. What remained was the in-between hour. The dog walkers, the stroller pushers, the old men playing chess near the water feature, the young woman in paint-splattered overalls, eating a sandwich alone on the steps, like she had nowhere else to be, and was perfectly fine with that. Atlanta, in the early fall, had a particular kind of light, the kind that came in at a low angle and turned everything amber and unhurried, like the city itself was taking a long breath before the evening. James did not notice any of it. He was 57 years old, and he was wearing a gray running suit. The same gray running suit he had put on every morning for the past 11 days, because it was the one thing he had grabbed without thinking when he packed the single bag that now sat under the cot in his room on Randolph Street. The suit had been expensive once. You could still tell if you looked closely by the cut of the shoulders and the weight of the fabric. But the left cuff had frayed at the edge, and the color had gone uneven in the way that happens when something has been through too much to hold its shape anymore. His hands were folded in his lap. His phone was in his pocket screen off. He had checked it that morning, out of habit, and found nothing. No missed calls, no messages, no calendar reminders, pulling him somewhere he needed to be. The screen had been as empty as the weeks stretching out in front of him, and he had put it away and not taken it out again. $2,800. That was what he had left in an account so small that the people who had taken everything else had not bothered with it. The house in Grosse Pointe was gone. The company 20 years of early mornings and late nights, and everything his father had taught him about building something that lasted, was gone. His wife had called her attorney before she called him. His son had gone quiet in the way that young people go quiet when they are calculating the cost of loyalty and finding it too high. He had driven 9 hours south with one bag and no plan, and ended up in Atlanta because it was the first city that appeared when he typed into his phone at 2 in the morning at a gas station outside of Chattanooga, looking for somewhere nobody knew his name. The food cart came from the north end of the plaza. One wheel pulled slightly left, giving it a lazy drift that the woman pushing it corrected, without thinking the way you correct for something you have been living with long enough to stop noticing. The cart was white with hand-lettered signage. Griot plantain frites sweet tea. The letters painted in red and gold with the careful hand of someone who understood that the sign was not just advertising, it was a promise. The woman behind it was in her mid-40s, solidly built, with a white apron over a dark shirt, and her hair wrapped in cloth, the deep orange of brick dust at sunset. She had the kind of face that had learned to read a room quickly, or in her case, a plaza, and she was reading this one as she moved through it, her eyes tracking the regulars, the newcomers, the ones who were hungry, and the ones who just needed somewhere to stand. She slowed when she reached his bench. Not all the way, just enough that the cart lost its momentum, and she had to put a little weight back into the handle. Her eyes moved over him, not rudely, not the way people look at someone they feel sorry for, but carefully, the way you look at something that has snagged your attention, and you are trying to understand why. She looked at his face. She looked at his hands. And then she looked at the gray running suit, and she stayed there a half-second longer than made sense. She did not say anything. She reached into the warming compartment, pulled out a container, and walked the short distance to his bench. She set it down on the empty seat beside him, griot over rice, from the smell of it, something deep and spiced and layered in a way that reached back past the hunger he had stopped paying attention to and reminded him that he had a body that needed things. She straightened up, looked at him once more. Then she walked back to her cart, found her grip, and moved on down the path toward the south end of the plaza without a word of explanation. James looked at the container, The smell coming through the cardboard lid was the kind of smell that belongs to a kitchen that has been cooking the same recipes for a long time, passed down through hands rather than written in books. It was the smell of something real in a way that very little had felt real to him in weeks. He did not open it. He sat with it beside him on the bench while the amber light faded to gray, in the plaza, filled and emptied again around him. He sat with it the way you sit with something that arrived without asking permission, and now you are not sure what to do with it. When the last of the light was gone, he finally reached over and picked it up. He stood. He walked back toward Randolph Street with the container warm between both palms, turning over in his mind the way that woman had looked at his gray running suit, not with curiosity, not with pity, but with something that looked uncomfortably like recognition. That night, lying on the cot in his room on Randolph Street, with the empty container on the floor beside him, he had eaten every last bite, somewhere around 8 o'clock, standing at the window in the dark. James Whitfield thought about his father. He thought about Robert Whitfield, the way you think about someone whose voice you can still hear clearly, even when everything else has gone quiet. Robert Whitfield had been an electrician for 41 years. He worked the south side of Detroit the way a doctor works a neighborhood, methodically, dependably, showing up when things went wrong and leaving them better than he found them. He drove a white van with a magnetic sign on the door that said Whitfield Electric in plain black letters, no logo, no tagline, because Robert believed that the work spoke for itself, and anything more was showing off. The van had 214,000 miles on it by the time Robert retired. He knew the exact number because he had written it in a small notebook he kept in the glove compartment, along with the addresses of every house he had ever wired. He grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment on Dexter Avenue, the son of a man who had come up from Mississippi in 1952 with a trade and a determination to build something in a city that was still back then making room for people who were willing to work for it. Robert inherited the trade and passed it down the same way, not through formal lessons, but through presence, through letting James hand him tools on Saturday mornings, through explaining while his hands were busy inside a circuit panel why electricity moves the way it does, why it always finds the path of least resistance, and why that is both its greatest strength and the thing that makes it dangerous if you do not understand it. James was 11 years old when his father took him to a house on Livernois Avenue where the family had been living without reliable power for 3 months because they could not afford the repair and the landlord would not return calls. Robert spent 4 hours on that job and charged nothing. On the drive home, James asked him why. Robert kept his eyes on the road for a long moment. Because the lights being on in that house tonight is worth more than what I would have charged, he said. And because somebody did the same thing for us once, a long time ago. You spend your whole life trying to return what you borrowed from the world. James did not fully understand it then. He would spend the next 4 decades learning what it meant. He was the first in his family to finish college, the University of Michigan, electrical engineering, on a combination of scholarships and loans he paid off in 3 years. He came back to Detroit not because there were no better opportunities elsewhere, but because South Side Detroit was where the need was, and James Whitfield had been raised to go where the need was. Whitfield Energy started in a rented garage on Fenkell Avenue with $8,000 in savings, 1 used truck, and a contract to retrofit a community center in Highland Park with solar panels under a federal energy assistance program. James worked the job himself, 12 hours a day, for 3 weeks straight. When it was done, the director of the center shook his hand and said it was the first time in 11 years the building's utility bills had come in under budget. That was the model, not luxury, not the gleaming downtown towers that made the architecture magazines. The model was simple: use the federal tax credit structure for clean energy to bring solar power to the households and community buildings that needed it most and could afford it least. The credits covered the gap. The families got lower bills. The buildings got reliable power. And Whitfield Energy grew slowly at first, then steadily, the way things grow when they are built on something real. By the time James turned 50, the company had brought clean power to more than 50,000 homes across Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana. He had 60 employees. His name had been in the pages of 2 national business publications. He sat on the board of a community development nonprofit he had helped found on the East Side. Robert came to the office once, just once, the year the company crossed the threshold of 10,000 installations. He stood in the lobby and looked at the wall where James had framed the original contract from the Highland Park Community Center, and he did not say anything for a long time. Then, he asked if there was somewhere he could wash his hands, because he had come straight from a job and did not want to touch anything. That was the whole visit, but James had understood. Around that same time, his son Marcus, 22 years old, sharp and restless, in the way of young men who have grown up watching their fathers build something and are not yet sure what they want to build, themselves called to say he had been offered a position in Atlanta. A new company, good money, a chance to get out of the Midwest and into a city that felt like it was moving. James told him to take it. He was proud and said so. What he did not say, because he did not yet know how, was that he wished they talked more, that he had spent so many years building the company that he had sometimes forgotten to build the relationship, that pride and presence are not the same thing, and he had confused them more often than he wanted to admit. The CFO position opened in the company's 8th year. James needed someone who could manage the financial architecture of a company that had outgrown what one man could hold in his head. He interviewed 11 candidates over 6 weeks. On the last day, a man named Victor Crane came in referred by 3 separate investors, a resume that read like it had been written to answer every concern James might have before he thought to ask it a handshake that was firm without being performed. The other 10 candidates had all asked at some point in their interviews about the mission, about the communities, about what it meant to build a company that measured success not just in revenue, but in the number of families who could keep the lights on without choosing between the electric bill and groceries. Victor Crane did not ask any of that. He asked about the capital structure, the credit allocation model, the growth projections for the next 5 years. His questions were precise and intelligent and exactly what a CFO should ask. James told himself that was a good sign, that Victor was the kind of person who dealt in facts and numbers and left the philosophy to others. He offered him the job that afternoon. It would be 8 years before James understood what it meant that Victor had never once asked what the company was actually for. 12 years before James Whitfield carried a cardboard container of Griot back to a room on Randolph Street. Yvonne Baptiste was standing on the Beltline at 5:47 in the morning, trying to remember how to breathe. The notice had been taped to the side of her cart sometime during the night. She had arrived at her usual spot, the stretch of the trail near the Irwin Street intersection, where the morning foot traffic picked up around 6 and stayed steady until 9, and found it already there, a bright orange rectangle against the white paint of the cart official, and indifferent. Unpaid permit fees. Unresolved code violations from an inspection 8 months ago that she had been disputing ever since. The cart was subject to impoundment. She had 72 hours. She had $23 in her apron pocket. She sat down on the curb beside the cart and looked at the notice and did not cry right away. She had learned in the 3 years since her marriage ended, and she had moved to Atlanta, knowing exactly nobody, that crying was something you had to budget carefully, the same way you budgeted everything else. You saved it for when it would actually help. She was not sure this was one of those times. The Beltline was quiet at that hour. A few joggers moved through, in the pale, early light, earbuds, in eyes forward, each one a separate world. The city beyond the trail was just beginning to stir, the low rumble of a garbage truck, somewhere on the far side of the trees, the first birds deciding it was time, the sky going from black to the particular shade of gray-blue that Atlanta wore in the minutes before the sun committed to rising. Yvonne had learned to cook in a kitchen the size of a generous closet in a house in Port-au-Prince, standing on a step stool beside a woman who measured nothing and forgot nothing. Her grandmother, whom she had called Mère Céleste since before she could properly say either word, had learned the recipes from her own mother, who had learned them from hers, a chain of women passing down knowledge through their hands rather than through any written record. Griot was the one Mère Céleste had been most particular about. The marinade, the timing, the oil temperature which you judge not by any thermometer but by sound. You listen, Mère Céleste had told her, standing over the pan with the patience of someone who had nowhere more important to be. When the oil stops talking and starts singing it is ready. You rush it, you ruin it. You wait for it, it gives you everything. Mère Céleste had been gone for 6 years, but Yvonne still heard her every time she worked the fryer. She had brought the recipe to Atlanta, the same way her grandmother had passed it down, not written anywhere, carried in her hands and her memory. The cart had been her way of making it mean something in a city that did not yet know her name. For 3 years, she had built something real on that stretch of the Beltline. Regular customers who came back not because it was convenient, but because the food was honest. A small reputation earned one plate at a time. And now an orange notice was telling her it could all be taken in 72 hours. She was still sitting on the curb when she heard the footsteps slow behind her. She did not look up right away. Joggers sometimes stopped to stretch near the cart or to check their pace on their watches, and she had learned not to read too much into pauses on the trail. But this pause was different, longer, with a quality of attention to it that was different from someone catching their breath. She looked up. A man in a gray running suit was standing about 10 feet away on the path. He was looking at the cart, at the orange notice, at her sitting on the curb with her hands in her lap and $23 in her apron pocket. He was tall, somewhere in his mid-40s, with the kind of face that had learned to stay still when it was thinking. He did not say anything. He did not ask what was wrong, or offer anything, or make any of the noises that people make when they want to appear helpful, without committing to actually being so. He looked at the situation for a moment, the way her grandmother used to look at a problem in the kitchen, assessing it, measuring it, deciding what it actually required rather than what it appeared to require. Then he nodded once, very slightly, as if he had reached some private conclusion, and continued down the trail. Yvonne watched him go. The gray suit disappeared around the curve, where the Beltline bent south toward Ponce de Leon, swallowed by the morning mist, before she could fully register that he had been there at all. She looked back at the orange notice. 20 minutes later, she heard footsteps, again the same rhythm, the same pace, coming back from the direction he had gone. She turned, but he was already moving past her cart, not stopping, not slowing. His hand came down briefly as he passed, and something landed on the pavement near her feet, without a sound. A plain, white envelope, unsealed, folded once. By the time she picked it up, he was already gone. The gray suit had dissolved back into the mist, the same way it had appeared, leaving nothing behind but the sound of footsteps fading and the envelope in her hand. Inside was enough cash to cover the permit fees, clear the violations, and keep her running for the next 2 months. And beneath the bills, folded into a small square, a piece of paper torn from what looked like the corner of a larger page. 7 words in plain, slightly slanted handwriting. Keep cooking. Someone needs what you make. No name, no number, nothing that would let her find him, thank him, or explain to anyone who asked why a stranger had done this. She read it 4 times, standing there on the Beltline, while the city woke up around her. Then she folded it carefully and tucked it into the inside pocket of her apron against her chest, where she would feel it every time she reached for the seasoning. That piece of paper had lived in her cart ever since, taped to the inside of the cabinet above the fryer, through 3 different carts, through a move across 2 states, through storms and setbacks that had tested her in ways she had not anticipated when she first came to this city, with a recipe and a step stool, in the voice of Mère Céleste, telling her to wait for the oil to sing. She had never seen the man's face clearly. She had never learned his name. She only knew the gray of his running suit against the morning mist and the particular quality of his attention and the 7 words he had left behind, like a hand placed briefly on a shoulder before someone walks back out into the world. There is a particular kind of intelligence that is very good at understanding how systems work and completely uninterested in whether those systems are being used for the right thing. Victor Crane had that kind of intelligence. It was the thing that made him exceptional at his job, and the thing that in the end made him dangerous. He had grown up in Cincinnati, the second son of an accountant who believed that numbers were the only honest language, that everything else people said could be interpreted a dozen different ways, but a balance sheet told you exactly what was true. Victor had inherited the belief, without the ethics that were supposed to accompany it. He understood from an early age that numbers could be arranged to tell different stories, depending on who was doing the arranging, and that most people who signed documents trusted the person who prepared them far more than they trusted their own ability to read them. He had built a career on that gap between trust and verification. When James Whitfield hired him in the company's 8th year, Victor had spent 15 years in clean energy finance, moving through 4 different firms with a reputation that was by every measurable standard spotless. His references were impeccable. His projections were consistently accurate. He arrived at Whitfield Energy at a moment when the company had grown past what one man's attention could manage, and he understood the architecture of what James had built better than almost anyone James had ever interviewed. For the first 2 years, he was everything James had hoped for. The books were clean, the reporting was thorough, the capital allocation made sense, and the growth followed the projections he had laid out in his first 90 days. James stopped looking over his shoulder at the numbers because the numbers had never once given him a reason to. That was, of course, precisely the point. In the 3rd year, Victor began making adjustments. Small ones, at first, reclassifying certain expenditures, creating sub-accounts within the existing structure that had legitimate-sounding purposes and required no additional authorization because they fell within the discretionary authority the CFO role had always carried. He was not careless about it. He was, if anything, almost artistic in the way he constructed the architecture, each piece fitting the next in a way that looked from any single vantage point entirely reasonable. The dual reporting system took 18 months to build properly. One set of numbers for the internal record, accurate, detailed, reflecting the actual movement of capital through the company. A second set for external reporting, adjusted, smoothed, presenting a picture of financial health that was not quite false enough to fail a surface review, but was sufficiently different from reality to conceal what was actually happening underneath. What was actually happening was that Victor Crane was redirecting a portion of Whitfield Energy's federal credit allocations into a series of consulting arrangements with firms that existed primarily on paper. The firms invoiced, the company paid, the money moved through 2 intermediary accounts and arrived eventually in places that had nothing to do with clean energy installation in underserved communities. His wife, Catherine, a quiet, careful woman who had been a tax attorney before she left practice to raise their 2 children, managed the family's personal finances with the same precision her husband applied to everything else. When Victor explained one evening over dinner that it would be prudent to restructure some of their personal assets, she had asked the questions a former tax attorney would ask and received answers that were technically accurate and strategically incomplete. She had not pressed further. There are things in a marriage that both people understand without ever saying aloud. 6 months before the structure Victor had built began to show the first hairline cracks, before the numbers started attracting the kind of attention that numbers attract when someone patient and thorough is looking for exactly the right thing. He made one additional move. He had been talking to Marcus for nearly a year by then. James's son was 27 sharp, in the way his father was sharp, but without the decade of discipline that had given James's intelligence its direction. Victor had met him at a company event 3 years earlier, and had kept the connection alive with the easy patience of someone who understood that relationships were assets, and assets required maintenance. When Victor quietly established a new advisory firm in Atlanta, a vehicle with a clean name and a legitimate-looking portfolio of clients, he offered Marcus a position as a senior associate. The salary was generous. The work was interesting. Atlanta was a city Marcus had already made his home. He signed the contract without asking in any meaningful way what the firm actually did or where its capital came from. Victor did not consider this a character flaw in the young man. He considered it an entirely predictable outcome of offering the right opportunity to someone at the right moment in their life. James knew his son had taken a new job in Atlanta. Marcus had called to tell him enthusiastic the way he got when something felt like momentum. James had said he was proud. He had not asked for details about the firm because Marcus had not offered them, and because James had learned over the years of his son's adult life to receive what was offered rather than push for what was withheld. On a Tuesday evening in November, Victor finished the last of his end-of-quarter adjustments at his desk on the 22nd floor and shut down his workstation. The office was empty. It was nearly 11. He gathered his coat from the back of his chair and walked toward the elevator, passing the row of offices along the north side of the floor. He stopped outside James's office. The door was open the way James always left it. Victor stood in the doorway and looked into the dark room. His eyes went, as they sometimes did when he passed this way, after hours, to the corner of James's desk. There was a framed photograph there, James and his family, from several years back, a summer afternoon, somewhere with water in the background. The three of them squinting into the sun with the slightly unpracticed smiles of people who do not take many pictures together. Victor looked at it for 5 seconds, perhaps 6. Then he reached inside the doorframe, found the light switch for the hallway, without looking, and turned it off. He walked to the elevator, in the dark, pressed the button, and rode down to the lobby alone. He did not look back. The call came at 6:47 on a Wednesday morning. James was standing at the kitchen counter in Grosse Pointe, waiting for the coffee to finish. 20 years of early mornings had trained him to be up before the house, before the city, before anyone needed anything from him. That first hour belonged to him. It always had. The number on the screen was unfamiliar. He picked up anyway. The man on the other end introduced himself as a senior investigator with the Securities and Exchange Commission. He spoke in the measured tone of someone who delivered difficult information for a living and had learned to do it without inflection. He asked James whether he was aware of a series of consulting arrangements between Whitfield Energy and several firms registered in Delaware. James said he was not. The investigator asked whether James was aware that his signature appeared on the authorization documents for those arrangements. James said that was not possible. The investigator said he understood, advised James to retain legal counsel before they spoke again, and ended the call. The coffee finished behind him. The morning light came through the kitchen window, the way it always did. Everything in the room looked exactly as it had 60 seconds ago. James stood in the middle of it and felt the floor shift beneath him in a way that had nothing to do with the floor. His attorney called within the hour. The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours and covered ground that James would spend weeks trying to fully absorb personal guarantee clauses, embedded in 4 years of financing documents, consulting arrangements with firms that existed primarily on paper capital that had moved through Whitfield Energy's accounts and arrived somewhere it was never supposed to go. Victor Crane had prepared every document. James had signed every one. He had trusted the man he hired to manage the numbers because the numbers had never once given him a reason not to. By noon, the company accounts were frozen. By 2 in the afternoon, James understood that the house in Grosse Pointe, the investment accounts, and the retirement fund he had been building since his 30s were all collateral for obligations he had not knowingly made. 20 years of work reduced to a liability with his name on it. Sandra came home at 4:30. She was a litigation consultant, precise, analytical, trained to hear the operative facts in any situation and respond to those, rather than to everything surrounding them. James told her what had happened. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked one question. "Is there anything that can be recovered?" He said he did not know yet, that it was early, that there were legal avenues being explored. She nodded. She went upstairs. That evening, James heard her on the phone. For a long time, not the words, just the cadence of a conversation being conducted with purpose. The attorney she had called was not his. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. Over the following 3 weeks, she moved through the situation with the quiet efficiency of someone executing a plan they had thought through carefully. And when she told James she was leaving, she used language so measured and so final that there was nothing in it to push back against. She had made a calculation. James understood it, even as it took something from him that he would not be able to name for a long time. He called Marcus the morning after. His son, 28 years old, living and working in Atlanta, building a life in a city that felt like forward motion, picked up on the third ring. James heard the quality of the silence before Marcus spoke. It was the silence of someone who had already heard, who had already decided, and was now managing the conversation from behind a careful distance. "Dad," a pause that lasted just long enough. "I'm sorry this is happening. Not what do you need. Not I'm coming. Just the grammar of a young man putting space between himself and something that frightened him. I can't be associated with this right now," Marcus said. "You understand." James said he did. He meant it. It hurt anyway. He packed one bag that night. Practical clothes, necessary documents, the small external hard drive he kept in the bottom desk drawer, years of financial records backed up out of habit, the same way his father had kept a notebook in the glove compartment with the address of every house he had ever wired. He left everything else where it was. He did not look around the house before he walked out. He drove south with the radio off and the windows cracked and the Ohio interstate unrolling ahead of him in the dark. He had no destination. He had $2,800 in an account too small to have been worth anyone's attention. A bag in the back seat and the particular hollowness of a man who had spent 20 years being someone and was now for the first time not sure what that meant. Around 2 a.m, he pulled off at a gas station outside Chattanooga. He sat in the parking lot with the engine running and opened the map on his phone. He did not type anything specific. He just looked at the road spreading south from where he was sitting at the names of cities he had no particular reason to choose. Atlanta was 90 minutes away. He could not have explained the choice if anyone had asked. There was no logic to it that he could articulate. He just looked at the name on the screen and felt for the first time in 3 days something that was not the specific weight of everything he had lost. He pulled back onto the interstate. The sun was coming up when he crossed into Georgia, turning the highway a flat gold that lasted about 20 minutes before the light climbed too high to be beautiful anymore. He passed the welcome sign. He passed the city limits. He took the first exit when it appeared and drove into the morning with Atlanta filling up the windshield ahead of him. Familiar, in the way that cities are familiar when you have seen enough of them. The skyline, the overpass, the early commuters already moving. He did not know he had been here before. He did not know what this city was already holding for him, patient and unhurried, the way certain things wait without knowing they are waiting. He took the exit and drove in. He found the room on Randolph Street, through a handwritten index card, taped to a telephone pole, 3 blocks from where he parked the car. That first morning, $150 a week, utilities included shared bathroom, no smoking, see Mrs. Patterson, first floor. Mrs. Patterson was a woman in her early 70s, with the bearing of someone who had seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by it. She looked at James for a moment when he knocked at the bag over his shoulder, at the suit he had been driving in for 9 hours, at the particular quality of stillness that had settled over him somewhere on the interstate and had not yet lifted, and asked him 2 questions. How long did he need the room, and did he have cash? He said he did not know, and yes. She handed him a key and told him the bathroom was second door on the left and that she collected rent in an envelope slid under her door on Monday mornings. That was the entire transaction. The room was on the third floor, small, functional, furnished, with the stripped-down practicality of a space that had housed many people who were between one thing and the next. A cot along the wall, a dresser with a stuck drawer, a window that looked out onto the brick face of the building across the alley, close enough that he could have reached out and touched it if the window had opened wide enough. A radiator in the corner that clicked 3 times every morning before it came on, like something working up the nerve to start. He put his bag on the floor beside the cot and sat down and looked at the wall. For the first 7 days, he did not go further than the bodega on the corner. He bought coffee in the morning and something to eat around noon and came back to the room and sat with the particular inertia of a man whose entire structure of daily purpose had been removed at once. He had spent 20 years in motion, meetings, decisions, phone calls, problems that needed solving, and people who needed answers. The stillness of that room on Randolph Street was not peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that has weight to it, that presses down on you from all sides and makes the simplest actions, getting up, going outside, deciding what to do with the next hour, feel like problems that require more resources than you currently have. He called his attorney twice. The updates were the kind that moved the situation forward technically, without changing anything that felt material. He did not call anyone else. There was no one else to call in a way that did not require him to explain himself, and he did not have the energy for explanation. On the 8th morning, he put on the gray running suit. It was the only athletic clothing he had packed, grabbed without thinking, from the hook behind the bedroom door in Grosse Pointe in the 15 minutes he had given himself to take what mattered. He had been running every morning for 11 years, 5 miles, the same route, through the neighborhoods north of the house, before the sun was fully up. It was the one habit that had never required justification. You laced up and went, and the body did the rest. He went down the stairs and out the front door of the building and turned east on Randolph Street and ran. Old Fourth Ward, in the early morning, had a quality that he had not expected. He had known the name. Everyone who knew anything about Atlanta knew the name, but he had not known the texture of it, the way the history of the place lived, in the architecture and the street names, and the particular mix of old and new that gave the neighborhood the feeling of a place that had been through something serious and was still in the process of deciding what it wanted to become. Auburn Avenue was 2 blocks south, the street where the movement had found its voice, where the institutions had been built that gave a generation the tools to demand what was already theirs. He ran past the church with the name carved in stone above the door, past the painted murals on the sides of buildings that had survived long enough to become landmarks, past the corner stores opening up for the morning alongside the newer cafes with their chalkboard menus and their line of customers already forming before 7. He ran 5 miles the first day. For the second, his legs had not fully forgiven him for the 9-hour drive. 5 again the third day, and then 5 every day after that, the same route, adjusting slightly as he learned which streets were smoother and which blocks had the kind of incline that made the return easier. Deshawn lived 2 doors down from him on the 3rd floor. He was 24, worked a delivery route that started before dawn and ended around 2 in the afternoon, and had the easy sociability of someone who treated strangers as friends he had not yet been introduced to. He knocked on James's door one evening to ask if he had a phone charger that fit a particular connector. James did not. Deshawn said no problem, leaned against the doorframe for a moment, and asked how he was settling in. James said fine. Deshawn nodded, like that was the right answer, and said if James ever wanted to know where to eat in the neighborhood, he had opinions, and then he went back down the hall. It was the most natural conversation James had had in 2 weeks. He stood in the doorway after Deshawn left and recognized, with some surprise, that it had cost him nothing. On the 14th morning, running the stretch of the Beltline Trail that curved past the eastern edge of Ponce City Market, his legs gave him their honest assessment of the morning's effort, and he slowed to a walk. The plaza was opening up vendors, arriving the first of the day's foot traffic, moving through the light, still low and soft, off the glass of the old building that had been a Sears warehouse once and was now something the city had found a new use for, the way cities do with the things they cannot bring themselves to tear down. He sat down on the third bench from the east entrance, just to rest, just until his legs decided they were ready to finish the last mile back to Randolph Street. The plaza moved around him, people with somewhere to be moving at the pace of people with somewhere to be. He watched them without particular feeling, not envy, not longing, just the neutral observation of a man who had temporarily lost his place in that kind of movement and was not yet sure how to find it again. His legs stopped aching after about 10 minutes. He stayed on the bench. The morning stretched out, and the plaza filled up around him, and he sat with his hands resting on his knees, and no pressing reason to be anywhere else, which was its own kind of answer to a question he had not quite formed yet. The first day, she came from the north end of the plaza. He did not hear her approach. One moment, the bench beside him was empty, and the next, a cardboard container was sitting on it, steam curling faintly from the seam of the lid. The woman who had placed it there was already walking away, white apron, dark shirt. The food cart drifting slightly left as she guided it back toward the main path. She did not look back. James looked at the container for a long time. Then he looked at the path where she had gone. Then he looked at the container again. He did not open it. He sat with it beside him until the steam stopped and the afternoon light moved off the bench entirely. And then he picked it up and carried it back to Randolph Street and ate it alone at the window, standing up, looking out at the brick wall across the alley. It was the best thing he had tasted in 3 weeks. He did not let himself think too much about that. The second day, she came at the same time, from the same direction. Same container, same quiet placement, same unhurried departure. He watched her go with the particular attention of a man who has run out of other things to pay attention to. The third day, he sat up a little straighter when he heard the wheel of the cart on the pavement. He told himself it was nothing, just a change in posture. On the fourth day, he opened the container before she reached the end of the path. The smell that came up griot over rice, something deep and layered with spice, and something underneath the spice that had no name he could find, stopped him in a way that was hard to account for. He ate half of it right there on the bench, while the city moved through the plaza around him, and the afternoon did what Atlanta afternoons did in the fall, going golden, and then amber, and then the particular shade of rose that the sky turned just before the light gave up entirely. She was still within sight when he looked up. He watched her navigate the south exit, correcting for the pull of the left wheel, without breaking stride, and disappear around the corner. The fifth day, she set the container down and did not immediately move away. She stood beside the cart with both hands on the handle and looked at the plaza ahead of her. James opened the container. He ate. She stayed. Neither of them said anything. After a few minutes, she pushed the cart forward and went on her way, and James sat with the empty container on his knee and the distinct impression that something had shifted, though he could not have said what. The sixth day, she set the container down and pulled the cart to the side of the path and sat on the bench. Not the bench he was on, the one beside it, the same bench where she had been placing the food. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked at the plaza, the same way he looked at it, which was to say, with a kind of patient attention that was not quite observation and not quite rest, but something in between. They sat like that for a while. Neither of them spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable in the way that silences between strangers usually are. It was more like the silence between two people who have agreed without discussing it to let the conversation wait until it was ready. Eventually, she stood, reclaimed the cart handle, and left. On the seventh day, after she set the food down, and before she could step back to the cart, James said the two words that had been sitting in him since the first afternoon. "Thank you." She looked at him, not with surprise, more with the expression of someone who had been waiting for a particular door to open, and was now simply noting that it had. She nodded once, then she moved on. The eighth day, she set the food down and sat beside him again, and after a few minutes of the now familiar quiet, she asked, without preamble, what his name was. He told her. She said her name was Yvonne. She said it the way people say their names, when they are not performing an introduction, but simply offering a fact, the way you hand someone something they asked for, without making a ceremony of the giving. They sat for a little while longer. She left. He finished the food, watching the last of the day's light drain out of the plaza, and thought about the particular quality of her attention, the way she asked questions without seeming to need the answers, to be anything other than what they were. On the 9th day, she set the food down and sat, and the quiet between them lasted about as long as it had been lasting, and then James started talking. He did not plan to. He had not said any of it out loud to anyone, not to his attorney, not to his father, not to the wall of his room on Randolph Street, on the nights when sleep did not come until very late. But something about the accumulated weight of 8 days of someone showing up without asking for anything in return made the words available in a way they had not been before. He told her about this company, about Victor, about the documents he had signed without reading, because the man who prepared them had spent 8 years earning the kind of trust that makes reading feel like an insult. He told her about Sandra and the particular efficiency with which his marriage had been concluded. He told her about Marcus and the phone call and the 8 seconds of silence before his son said what he had decided to say. Yvonne listened the way she did everything, without hurry, without visible judgment, without the small sounds people make when they are preparing their response, instead of actually hearing what you are saying. When he finished, the plaza was nearly empty. The vendors were packing up. A man with a push broom was working his way across the far end of the courtyard with the methodical patience of someone who did this every evening and had made his peace with it. Yvonne was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, "Do you still have the files?" James looked at her. "What files?" "The ones that show what he actually did," she said. "Not what he told everyone he did. The real ones." He thought about the hard drive in the bag under his cot on Randolph Street. He had packed it without thinking, the way you pack the things that feel essential, even when you cannot explain why. "I might have something," he said. Yvonne nodded slowly, as if that was the answer she had been sitting here for 9 days waiting to hear. Harold Kim had been eating at Yvonne's cart every Friday evening for 3 years. Same time, same order, same exact change left on the counter without being asked. Yvonne had known his name for 2 months before she knew what he did for a living, and when she found out forensic accountant, 30 years of following money through structures designed to make it disappear. She had filed that information away, the way she filed most things that might one day be useful. That day had come. She told James about Harold the morning after their 9th conversation on the bench. She did not oversell it. She said there was a man who spent his life finding what people tried to hide in financial records, that he had been eating her food long enough to trust her judgment, and that she thought James should sit across from him with the hard drive and let Harold tell him what he was actually looking at. James asked if Harold was expecting them. Yvonne said no and picked up 2 containers of griot. Harold's office was on the 4th floor of a building on Peachtree Street, orderly, in the way that suggested not neatness as preference, but precision as necessity, labeled files, books by subject, a single framed photograph of his father outside a small accounting practice in Decatur, 1983. He came to his office door himself when the receptionist called back. He was shorter than James had expected, with reading glasses on a cord around his neck, and the unhurried manner of someone who had learned that genuine emergencies announce themselves without being rushed. He looked at Yvonne. He looked at James. He looked at the containers. "It's Tuesday," he said. "I know," Yvonne said. He stepped back and waved them in. James set the hard drive on the desk without preamble and said what needed to be said. The SEC investigation, the consulting arrangements. He had not authorized the signatures on documents. Victor had prepared 8 years of trust that had apparently been moving in 2 directions at once. He kept it to the facts. Harold listened without writing anything down, then held out his hand for the drive. He plugged it in. He put both hands flat on the desk. He began to read. 31 minutes passed. James watched the clock on the wall. analog plain face, because he needed somewhere to put his attention. That was not Harold's expression, which had not changed in any readable way since the moment he started scrolling. Harold went back through files. He opened 2 documents side by side and studied them together. He removed his glasses, cleaned them on his shirt, put them back on. He leaned toward the screen once, then settled back. Yvonne sat beside James and ate her griot with the composure of someone who understood that certain rooms required stillness and that she was capable of providing it for as long as necessary. When Harold finally looked up, he took a moment before speaking, the pause of a man letting a significant reorganization of his understanding settle before he put it into words. "There is a file on this drive," he said, "that you did not create." James straightened. "The metadata is clear," Harold continued. "It was copied onto this drive from another machine. The originating source is identifiable." He turned the monitor so James could see the screen. Among the columns of quarterly reports and financial records, a single file sat in the root directory, unlike anything around it. Plain name, no extension, nothing about it that blended into the surrounding architecture of 20 years of company documents. "You read this first." Beside it, the creation date. James looked at the date and felt something move through him that he could not immediately name. Not recognition, but something just beneath it, something that registered in the body before the mind caught up. "It has never been opened," Harold said. The office was quiet. Outside, Peachtree Street moved at its usual pace, indifferent to what was happening 4 floors up. The air conditioning unit below the window ran its steady, low hum, a sound that had been present the entire time, and that neither James nor Harold had registered until the room became still enough to hear it. Harold looked at him steadily. "Do you want to open it here?" James looked at the file name. He looked at the date again. He thought about the hard drive sitting under his cot on Randolph Street for weeks, packed without thinking, kept without knowing why, carried the way you carry things that feel essential before you understand what they are for. He nodded. Harold placed his hand on the mouse. His index finger rested on the left button and did not move. The hum of the air conditioning filled the silence. The file opened. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The screen filled with text and numbers, arranged in a structure that James recognized immediately. The formatting of internal financial documentation, the kind his company had been producing for 20 years. Column headers, date ranges, account identifiers. The architecture of a record kept by someone who knew exactly what they were recording and intended it to be legible. Harold leaned forward. He read in silence, scrolling slowly the way someone reads when they are not skimming for summary, but absorbing every line for what it actually says. James watched the reflection of the screen in Harold's glasses and understood nothing from it. The numbers moved too fast. The structure was too dense. But he watched anyway, because there was nothing else to do, and because the quality of Harold's attention told him that what was on that screen was not nothing. The file was long. Harold read all of it. At some point, Yvonne set her empty container on the floor beside her chair and folded her hands in her lap and waited with the particular patience she brought to everything. Not passive, not detached, but present in a way that took up no space and asked for nothing. Harold stopped scrolling. He went back to the beginning of the file. He read the first section again, more slowly this time. Then he opened a second window, alongside it, one of James's quarterly reports from 3 years prior, and placed them side by side on the screen. He looked at them together for a long time without speaking. Then he sat back. He took his glasses off and set them on the desk in front of him, not on the cord, on the desk, which James had not seen him do before. He looked at the surface of the desk for a moment. Then he looked at James. "The file contains 2 parallel sets of financial records," Harold said, "covering a period of approximately 4 years. The first set matches the external reporting your company filed during that period, the numbers that went to investors, to regulators, to the federal agencies administering your credit allocations." He paused. "The second set is different." James said nothing. "The second set shows the actual movement of capital during that same period," Harold continued. It documents a series of payments to consulting entities that do not appear in your approved vendor records. It traces those payments through intermediate accounts and identifies the destination accounts by number. He stopped. There are 5 destination accounts. All 5 are registered offshore. All 5 received funds during the period covered by this file. The air conditioning ran its steady hum. Outside, the afternoon had moved on without them. Peachtree Street was doing what Peachtree Street did at this hour, indifferent to the 4 people on the 4th floor, sitting with the specific gravity of a room where something important has just shifted. Every transaction is dated, Harold said. Every transfer amount is recorded to the cent. The file includes the authorization metadata for each transaction, the machine identifier, the user credentials, the timestamp. He picked up his glasses and held them without putting them on. This is not a summary. This is not a reconstruction. This is a contemporaneous record kept in real time by whoever initiated these transactions. James felt the particular stillness of a man who has just been handed back something he did not know had been taken from him. The originating machine for this file, Harold said, is the same machine that created the consulting authorization documents with your signature. Office 4, 22nd floor, Whitfield Energy, Detroit. The room was very quiet. Harold set his glasses back on the cord around his neck. He looked at James with the expression of a man who had spent 30 years in rooms like this one and had learned to deliver what the evidence said without editorializing, but who understood in this particular moment that the evidence said something that required a certain care in the delivery. This is a confession, Harold said, complete, organized, and signed with metadata that will hold up in federal court. He paused, the pause of someone choosing the next words with precision. Whoever put this here wanted it to be found. James looked at the screen. He looked at the 2 sets of records, sitting side by side, the version of his company's financial history that the world had seen, and the version that had actually been true. 4 years of parallel reality, documented by the person who had created the divergence, preserved on a drive that had traveled from a desk drawer in Grosse Pointe to a gas station outside Chattanooga, to a cot on Randolph Street, to this office on Peachtree Street. Harold picked up his phone. I need to make a call, he said. Tonight. Before this goes any further, the right people need to know this exists. He looked at James. You should be prepared for things to move quickly after that. James nodded. He was looking at the screen again, specifically at the header information at the top of the file, the technical metadata that Harold had referenced. Creation date, timestamp, machine identifier. He looked at the date. He looked at it again. The 14th of March, a Tuesday. The year was the one Harold had said 8 months before the Wednesday morning phone call that had ended everything. James knew that date. He had known it for 57 years, in the way you know the dates that belong to the people who matter to you before you matter to yourself. It was his father's birthday. Robert Whitfield, 81 years old, South Side, Detroit. 41 years of wiring other people's houses and coming home with the addresses written in a notebook in the glove compartment. James sat with that for a moment. The date, the coincidence, the way the mind reaches for meaning in the details, when the larger picture is still too large to hold. He did not know what it meant that the file had been created on that particular day. He did not know if it meant anything at all, but he did not think it was nothing. The SEEC received Harold's filing at 9 o'clock on Monday morning. By 2 in the afternoon, a forensic audit team had been assigned. By 4 o'clock, the paperwork authorizing the freeze of Victor Crane's personal and professional accounts had been signed by a federal judge in the Northern District of Georgia. The system, once it had what it needed, moved with the particular efficiency of an institution that had been waiting for exactly this kind of documentation and knew precisely what to do with it. Victor received the notification at 4:47. He was at his desk in the office he had leased on the 31st floor of a building in Midtown Atlanta. A clean space, well-appointed, the kind of office that communicated stability and discretion to the clients of the advisory firm he had established after leaving Whitfield Energy. He read the notification on his screen without moving for approximately 90 seconds. Then he picked up his phone. He did not call his attorney first. He called Catherine. She answered on the second ring. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. James would never know what was said during those 4 minutes, and it did not matter. What mattered was that by the time Victor ended the call and finally dialed his attorney, certain things had already been set in motion that could not be reversed, the same way certain things had been set in motion 8 years ago in a conference room in Detroit and had run their course in one direction, until a hard drive and a forensic accountant and a woman who sold griot on the Beltline had sent them running in another. Harold called James that evening. He delivered the information, the way he delivered everything, sequentially, without embellishment, giving James the facts in the order they had occurred, and leaving space for James to absorb each one before moving to the next. The audit team had confirmed the dual record system. The 5 offshore accounts had been traced through 3 different jurisdictions. The consulting entities had been identified as shells, registered addresses that turned out to be mailboxes, directors who existed only on incorporation documents. No employees, no operations, no purpose beyond receiving and forwarding funds. James listened from the chair beside the window in his room on Randolph Street. The brick wall across the alley was dark. Somewhere below the street was doing its evening things, a car passing someone's music from an open window 2 floors down, the distant sound of the city settling into itself for the night. He did not feel what he had expected to feel. He had thought, in the weeks since the Wednesday morning phone call, that if the moment ever came when the truth was confirmed, when someone with the credentials and the evidence said, yes, this was done to you, this was not your failure, he would feel something large and immediate. Relief or vindication or anger, finally finding its proper address. Instead, he felt tired, the specific tiredness of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been told he can set it down, and whose body has not yet received the message. There's something else, Harold said. He explained it carefully. In the course of tracing the 5 offshore accounts, the audit team had identified 2 additional companies that had received payments through the same network during an overlapping period. Both were clean energy firms. Both were based in the Southeast. Both were led by men whose names James did not recognize, but whose situations, as Harold described them, were familiar in every material detail. A trusted financial officer, a dual record system, personal guarantees attached to debt the principals had not knowingly incurred, companies that had collapsed under the weight of obligations their founders had not understood they were carrying. Both of those men had concluded that they had failed, that the market had turned against them, or that their judgment had been insufficient, or that they had simply not been good enough at the thing they had spent years building. Neither of them had known there was another explanation. They didn't know about each other, Harold said, and they didn't know about you. James sat with that for a moment. 3 companies, 3 men who had built something real and watched it come apart and spent the time since trying to understand what they had done wrong. The answer, in each case, had been the same, and none of them had been able to see it, because the answer was not in anything they had done. It was in what had been done to them carefully and patiently, by someone who understood that the most effective place to hide a pattern is inside the individual failures of the people it has been applied to. Are they willing to come forward? James asked. That's being discussed, Harold said. Your documentation makes it possible in a way it wasn't before. What you brought in is the thread that connects all 3 situations. Without it, each case looks like an isolated business failure. With it, he paused. With it, it looks like what it is. James said he understood. He thanked Harold and ended the call and sat for a while in the chair by the window without turning on the light. 3 days later, a brief item appeared in the business section of a national publication. It described an ongoing SEC investigation into a network of fraudulent consulting arrangements connected to several clean energy companies in the Southeast. It named Whitfield Energy. It named the advisory firm Victor had established after leaving. It named Victor Crane as a person of interest in the investigation. It did not name James as anything other than the founder of one of the affected companies. Marcus read the article on a Tuesday evening in his apartment in Midtown Atlanta, 4 blocks from the building where Victor's office occupied the 31st floor, a proximity that Marcus had not known to consider significant until the moment he read the article and understood with the particular clarity of something that cannot be unknown once it is known exactly what kind of firm he had been working for and exactly what his salary had been paid with. He read the article twice. He set his phone face down on the table. He picked it up again. His father's number was still in his contacts, unchanged, in the same place it had always been. He looked at it for a long time. The article was 412 words long. Marcus had counted them without meaning to, the way the mind sometimes imposes order on things when it is trying to slow itself down enough to process what it is reading. He had read it the first time at normal speed and understood the surface of it. He had read it the second time more slowly, stopping at certain phrases, going back, reading them again. Person of interest, fraudulent consulting arrangements, Whitfield Energy, Victor Crane. The name of the advisory firm where Marcus had been working for the past 6 months appeared in the 3rd paragraph, identified as one of the entities under investigation. The firm's address was listed, the floor number, the building on Midtown's west side where Marcus had sat at a desk 4 days a week and done the work he had been hired to do, and asked in any meaningful way almost none of the questions he should have asked before he signed the contract. He set his phone face down on the table. The apartment was quiet around him, the particular quiet of a Tuesday evening, in a building full of people who were home but contained each inside their own walls. He had lived in Atlanta for 8 months. He had taken the position with Victor's firm because the salary was real and the work was interesting, and Atlanta felt like motion in a way that Detroit had stopped feeling for him, and because a man he had met at a company event 3 years ago had called him personally and told him there was a role that seemed like a good fit. And Marcus had been flattered in the way young people are flattered when someone they perceive as accomplished takes a specific interest in them. He had not asked where the capital came from. He had not asked what the firm's actual relationship was to the companies it advised. He had asked the questions that a person asks when they want the answer to be yes, when the offer is good, and the city is right, and the alternative is admitting that you do not entirely understand what you are walking into. He picked up his phone. He turned it face up. His father's number sat in his contacts, the way it had always sat, unchanged, undeleted, in the same position in the list it had occupied since Marcus was old enough to have a phone, and his father's number was the first one programmed into it. He had not called it in 4 months. He had told himself during those 4 months various things about why that the situation was too complicated, that there was nothing useful he could offer. That distance was sometimes the honest response when you did not know what to say. He understood now that those were the reasons a person constructs when the real reason is simpler and harder to say out loud. He had been afraid, not of his father, of what choosing his father would have cost him, at a moment when cost was the primary lens through which he had been seeing everything. He pressed the number. It rang once. It rang twice. On the 3rd ring, Marcus became aware that he was holding his breath, and on the 4th ring, he became aware that his father might not answer. And on the 5th ring, he understood that his father would have every reason not to. And on the 6th ring, the line opened. Silence. Not the silence of a call that has not connected the silence of a person who has picked up and is waiting, who has made the decision to answer, and is now giving the other person the space to say whatever they called to say. Dad, 8 seconds passed. Marcus counted those too. I didn't know. The words came out smaller than he had intended. Not because he had not meant them, but because saying them out loud in the specific direction of the person they most needed to reach made them feel both more true and more inadequate than they had seemed in his head. About the firm, about what he was doing. I didn't know any of it. Another silence. Shorter this time. I know, his father said. 2 words. Quiet, without performance. Not "I forgive you," not "it's okay," just the plain acknowledgement of a man who had spent enough time sitting with the reality of what had happened to have arrived somewhere in those weeks, on the bench, in the room on Randolph Street, at a place that was not bitterness and not absolution, but something more durable than either. "I should have called," Marcus said, "before this. I should have called a long time before this." His father did not tell him it was fine. He did not offer the easy reassurance that would have made the conversation lighter and meant less. He said, "Tell me what you know about the firm." And Marcus told him. He talked for 20 minutes, without stopping, what he had been hired to do, what he had observed, the clients he had worked with, the financial structures he had been asked to help maintain, without being given full visibility into their underlying logic. He was precise in the way his father had taught him to be precise about numbers, not overstating, not understating, giving the facts in the order they occurred, and flagging clearly the things he knew versus the things he had inferred. James listened without interrupting. When Marcus finished, there was a brief silence, and then his father asked a single question. The question Marcus had known was coming from the moment he pressed the call button. "Are you willing to talk to the investigators?" Marcus looked at the article still open on his screen. At the firm's name in the third paragraph, at the 412 words that had reorganized everything he thought he understood about the past 8 months of his life. 7 seconds. "Yes," he said. Outside the apartment window, Atlanta moved through its Tuesday evening, without particular awareness of the conversation happening on the 14th floor. The city doing what cities do, which is to continue regardless, patient and indifferent, while the people inside it work out the things that only people can work out. It happened on a Wednesday, 10:23 in the morning, according to the timestamp on the photograph that appeared online within the hour. Victor Crane, walking through the lobby of the building on Peachtree, where his advisory firm occupied the 31st floor. 2 federal agents at his sides, his wrists joined in front of him by something that the photograph cropped just enough to leave to the imagination of anyone who looked at it. He was wearing a navy suit, a striped tie, blue and white, shoes that had been polished recently. He looked from the angle the photograph had been taken, like a man on his way to a meeting, composed upright, moving at a deliberate pace through a lobby he had crossed hundreds of times. The only thing that did not fit the image of a man on his way to a meeting was that he was not the one choosing the direction. He did not look at the camera. The receptionist at the front desk watched him pass. The security guard held the door. A woman in the lobby, who had been waiting for an elevator, stood to one side and held her bag against her chest and did not move until the doors closed behind them. The photograph was taken by someone who had been positioned on the sidewalk outside and who had clearly known in advance that there was something worth waiting for. Within 40 minutes, the image had been picked up by 3 national outlets. By noon, it was the most shared item in the business news cycle, not because financial fraud cases were unusual, but because the story behind this one, as it was now being told, was the kind that people recognized as meaning something beyond the specifics of the case itself. 3 companies, 3 men who had built something in communities that needed what they were building. 1 person who had understood how to use their trust against them. That was the story. Once it was told that way, it had a particular gravity to it. Sandra Whitfield read the article in the kitchen of her apartment on the north side of the city. A different kitchen from the one in Grosse Pointe, smaller, with a window that looked out onto a courtyard instead of a yard. She had moved 6 weeks after leaving the house, with the same efficiency she brought to everything she decided to do. The apartment was orderly. The life she had rebuilt inside it was orderly. She had her work and her routines and the careful structure of a person who had chosen consciously to build something that depended on no one but herself. She read the article twice. She set her phone down on the counter. The phone did not ring that morning the way it once would have the calls from colleagues, from people in her professional circle who would have wanted to discuss this kind of story, to place it in context, to be the first to have an opinion about it. Those calls had stopped coming some months ago, in the gradual way that things stop when the reason for them has changed. She had noticed it the way you notice a sound that has been present for a long time and has finally gone quiet. She stood at the counter for a while. Then she put the phone in her bag and went to work. Harold called James at 11. He said it simply and directly, which was the only way Harold said anything. Victor had been taken into custody that morning. The documentation James had provided, combined with the testimony being coordinated across all 3 cases, had given the federal prosecutors what they needed to move. There would be a process from here, hearings, filings, the long institutional machinery of a case of this complexity, working its way through the system. But the central question of whether Victor Crane would be held accountable for what he had done had, as of 10:23 that morning, received its first clear answer. James thanked him and set the phone down on the cot. He sat for a while without moving. The radiator clicked 3 times and came on. The brick wall across the alley received the mid-morning light at a low angle that lit the upper portion and left the lower half in shadow the same way it did every day at this hour. He had expected, when this moment came, to feel something more than what he felt. The weight that had been sitting in him for months was still there, not lighter, not heavier, just different in quality. The way the same stone feels different when you understand where it came from. He put on his jacket and walked to Ponce City Market. Yvonne was already at the bench when he arrived, the cart parked to the side, 2 containers on the seat between them, a Tuesday afternoon settling into the kind of light that Atlanta did well in the fall. They ate without talking about what had happened. James had not told her about the call, but she had a way of reading the air around a situation that made explanation feel redundant. They sat, the way they had been sitting for weeks now. Not quite the silence of strangers, and not quite the ease of people who had known each other a long time, but something that had developed its own texture, its own rhythm, its own understanding of what needed to be said and what did not. At some point, Yvonne looked at him at his jacket, at the gray running suit, visible at the collar, where the jacket had shifted, and her eyes stayed there for a moment that was a half-second longer than it had been the last time. Her hand moved to the pocket of her apron, a small, unconscious motion, then stilled. She did not say anything. The afternoon moved past them. The plaza went through its routines. Eventually, Yvonne stood and reclaimed the cart handle and began to move away. She stopped after 3 steps. She did not turn around. She stood with her back to him, both hands on the cart, looking at the path ahead. "Same time tomorrow," she said. She pushed the cart forward and disappeared around the south corner of the plaza without looking back. James watched the space where she had been until there was nothing left to watch. He sat with the empty containers on the bench beside him and the particular echo of 3 words that should have been ordinary, that he had heard from her in some form nearly every day for weeks, but that landed differently, this time in a way he could not account for. Something about the way she had stopped. Something about the way she had not turned around. Something about 3 words spoken to the middle distance that felt for reasons he could not name, like they were carrying more than their surface meaning. He did not know what it was. He sat with it the way he had learned in the past months to sit with things he did not yet understand, without forcing them, without looking away. The light changed. The plaza emptied. He stayed. She didn't sleep. Yvonne Baptiste lay on the narrow cot behind the prep counter, still in her apron, staring at the ceiling of the truck, while Atlanta made its nighttime sounds around her. A siren 4 blocks east, the low hum of a generator, someone's music drifting up from Sweet Auburn, and then gone. The piece of paper sat on the prep counter beside the cutting board. She hadn't moved it. She hadn't thrown it away. She had read it 11 times. "Keep cooking. Someone needs what you make." At 3 in the morning, she got up, turned on the small counter lamp, and read it again. The handwriting was hurried but deliberate, the kind of handwriting that belonged to someone who normally wrote slowly and carefully, but had written this fast before he could change his mind. She knew that kind of handwriting. She had seen it once before. The Beltline, 12 years ago, October. She had been parked near Irwin Street, the truck barely 3 months old. The menu half What it was, now, her confidence, somewhere between fragile and gone. A man in a gray running suit had stopped. Not for the food, he'd already been walking away when he came back. He left an envelope on the service ledge, without a word, without waiting for her to open it, without looking back. She remembered his posture, the way he carried his shoulders, not like someone showing off, but like someone who had decided a long time ago that he was responsible for the weight he carried. The gray suit, the particular way he moved, left foot, landing a half-second longer than the right, a small asymmetry she had noticed because she noticed everything about people who came to her window. She had opened the envelope after he was gone, inside enough to cover 2 months of commissary fees, and a note in hurried, deliberate handwriting. She had kept the note for 11 years. In the back of a recipe book her grandmother had left her. Mère Celeste's handwriting on the cover, the envelope gone, the note still there. She had not known his name. She arrived at Centennial Olympic Park an hour before her usual time. She set up slowly, watching the path. The sky was the particular dark blue that comes just before the city remembers it needs to wake up. She told herself she was early because the prep work needed doing. She told herself a lot of things she didn't quite believe before 6 in the morning. She saw him before he reached the truck. Gray running suit. The same particular gray. Not charcoal, not ash. Something between the two. He was moving at a steady pace, not fast. The kind of running that isn't about speed, but about not stopping. Left foot landing a half-second longer than the right. She gripped the edge of the counter, the small asymmetry. 12 years older, the same asymmetry. He reached the window. He was breathing evenly, the way men breathe when they've been running long enough that their bodies have stopped arguing about it. He looked up. She had already put the container together. Accra plantain, frites, the coffee the way he took it. She set it on the ledge. He reached for his wallet. She slid a piece of paper across the ledge first. Not the original. She would not give him the original that lived in Mère Celeste's recipe book and would stay there until she decided otherwise. This was the one she had written out at 3 in the morning by the counter lamp in her own handwriting, copying his words exactly. Keep cooking. Someone needs what you make. He looked at it. He looked at it for a long time. She watched his face change. Not dramatically. Not the way faces change in films, but the way a room changes. When someone opens a window that's been shut for years. Something shifted behind his eyes. His hand, still on the ledge, went still. That's my handwriting, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, she said. He looked up at her. She held his gaze and didn't fill the silence with anything, because some silences are not empty. They are full of everything that would be smaller if you put it into words. He sat down on the bench across from the truck. He did not go anywhere. The food cooled between them. She leaned against the inside of the counter. Neither of them spoke. The sky to the east had begun to shift, the dark blue, pulling back at the edges, a thin, pale line appearing over the buildings on the far side of the park. Atlanta, waking up in the only way Atlanta knew. How, slowly then, all at once. After a while, Yvonne began to pack up the morning's remaining containers. She moved without hurry, without ceremony. She folded the prep towels. She latched the small cooler. She did what closing looked like when you weren't really closing, just giving someone room to breathe. She did not pick up the piece of paper. She left it on the bench beside him, the copy she had made at 3 in the morning, in her handwriting his words. She unlatched the brake on the rear wheel, moved around to the front of the truck, and pushed. She didn't look back. James Whitfield sat alone on the bench with the piece of paper resting on his knee. The park was beginning to fill a woman with a stroller on the far path, 2 men in suits cutting across the South End pigeons, reorganizing themselves near the fountain. The city assembling itself around him, as if he were simply part of the morning. He looked down at the paper. 7 words. His handwriting or hers, it didn't matter now, because the words were the same either way. Keep cooking. Someone needs what you make. He read them again. He didn't know when he said them quietly into the morning air of Atlanta, whether he was saying them to her, or whether 12 years later she had just said them back to him. His father never told the story the same way twice. The details shifted, depending on the year, depending on how tired Robert Whitfield was when he told it, depending on whether he was talking to James directly or talking at the wall above the kitchen sink, the way he sometimes did when he thought no one was listening. But the center of it never moved. The center was always the same. A Tuesday in October 1971, a construction site on the east side of Detroit, in a decision that cost Robert Whitfield his job by Thursday afternoon. James was 13 the first time he heard the full version. He had come home from school to find his father at the kitchen table, not eating, not reading, just sitting with both hands flat on the surface, as if checking whether it was still solid. Robert Whitfield was not a man who sat without purpose. In 41 years of working with his hands, he had perfected the art of useful stillness, the kind of stillness that meant he was thinking through a problem before he touched it. This was different. This was the stillness of a man who had already made a decision and was living inside the aftermath. James set his backpack down quietly and sat across from him. His father looked up. He didn't ask about school. He said, "You know what I did in 71. James shook his head. Robert looked back at his hands. He was quiet long enough that James thought the conversation was already over. Then his father began to talk. October 1971. The job was a commercial building going up on Gratiot Avenue, 4 stories Union Crew. The kind of project that ran on a schedule so tight that every delay cost somebody money they didn't have patience to lose. Robert was 29. He had been an electrician for 6 years. He knew what correctly run conduit looked like, knew what correctly gauged wire looked like, and he knew the moment he walked through the 4th floor on a Tuesday morning that what the subcontractor had installed the previous week was neither. The wire gauge was wrong. Not wrong in a way that would fail inspection immediately. Wrong in a way that would hold for years, maybe a decade, and then fail at the worst possible moment at load in winter, in a building full of people who had no reason to suspect the walls were lying to them. He documented what he found. He wrote it up on a single sheet of paper in the careful, even handwriting that James would inherit without knowing it, and he brought it to the site foreman before lunch. The foreman looked at the paper. He looked at Robert. He said the subcontractor was already behind by a week, and the building owner was already making phone calls. He said the gauge would probably be fine. He said probably the way men say it when they have already decided they don't want to know the answer. Robert said probably isn't the same as yes. He was let go on Thursday. Budget cuts, the foreman said. Robert had been the last hired on that crew. The math was convenient. He finished telling it the same way every time, even when the other details shifted. "I went home," Robert said. "I told your mother. She didn't say much. She made dinner. We ate." He paused. "Next morning, I got up, put on a clean shirt, and went to find another job." James waited for the rest. The lesson. The line that wrapped it up and made it mean something, the way lessons were supposed to work. It didn't come. He waited another year before he understood that the not coming was the point. Robert Whitfield had worked for 11 different employers over 41 years. He had been passed over for foreman twice, once in 1974, once in 1981, in favor of men who were by any technical measure less qualified. He had watched 2 of those men make decisions on job sites that he would not have made, and both times he had said nothing because the decision wasn't his to make. He had worked in summer heat that warped the tools in his belt, and in winter cold that made the wire brittle and uncooperative. He had never, in 41 years, installed something he knew to be wrong. Not because someone was watching, because the building would be there after he was gone, and people he would never meet would be inside it, and they would have no way of knowing whether the man who ran the wire on the 4th floor had decided that probably was good enough. James had built a company on the same logic, not consciously, not as a tribute, but in the way children absorb what they live inside of. Whitfield Energy existed because James believed that the infrastructure of power, who had it, who built it, who maintained it, was a question of moral weight, not just market position. You built it right, or you didn't build it. He understood sitting on the park bench with 7 words on his knee and the Atlanta morning assembling itself around him, that this was also what had broken him when the fraud came to light. It wasn't the money. It wasn't the public collapse, the press coverage, The 11 months of silence from men who had called themselves colleagues. It was the fact that something he had built to be true had been made without his knowledge into a lie. Someone had run the wrong wire through his walls, and he hadn't known. And people he would never fully be able to account for had been inside it. His father had found out on a Tuesday and been let go by Thursday. James had found out in May and was still finding out. The bench was hard beneath him. The paper on his knee had warmed to the temperature of his hand. Across the park, the city was fully awake now. Foot traffic on the paths, the sound of buses on Techwood. A vendor somewhere setting up a cart with a sound of metal on concrete that carried clean and sharp through the morning air. He folded the paper once along the existing crease. He put it in the pocket of his gray running suit. He sat a while longer, the way his father used to sit at the kitchen table, both hands flat, checking whether the surface was still solid. It was. Harold Kim called at 8:30 on a Thursday morning. James was at the table in the Randolph Street room, coffee going cold beside him, the gray running suit folded on the chair in the corner where he had placed it the night before, with more care than the garment strictly required. He had been sitting with a legal pad and a pen, writing nothing. When the phone rang, he answered it on the second ring, which was faster than he usually moved those days. "There's something you need to read," Harold said. No preamble. After 7 months of working together, they had arrived at a communication style that suited them both: direct, economical without the performance of softening. "What is it?" "A letter. Victor wrote it. It was in the personal safe in his home office." A pause. "Catherine Crane brought it to the attorneys yesterday afternoon. She found it after he was taken in. She said she didn't read past the first paragraph." Another pause, shorter. "I believe her." James said nothing. "I can bring it to you," Harold said. "Or I can read you the relevant sections over the phone. Your call." "Bring it," James said. Harold arrived at 11. He sat across the table from James, set a manila envelope between them, and folded his hands. He did not open the envelope himself. He waited. James picked it up. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No letterhead, no date, handwritten in Victor Crane's meticulous script. The handwriting James had seen on contracts, on quarterly reports, on the margins of documents, where Victor left his precise small notations. The same handwriting. Steadier than James had expected. He read it straight through without stopping. "James, I don't know if you'll read this. I wrote it, knowing you probably wouldn't, which made it easier to write honestly. The file on your external drive, the one Harold Kim found, the one that gave you back everything I put it there. You already know that. What you don't know is why. And I find that I want to explain it, not because an explanation changes anything, but because you deserve to know the exact shape of what happened." It was a Tuesday night in March, late past midnight. Everyone else had gone home. I was working through the Q4 projections, and I had the desk lamp on, and nothing else. And at some point, I stopped looking at the screen, and I looked at your desk instead. You keep a photograph on the left side of your desk. Your son, maybe 10 years old in the picture, standing in front of something I could never quite make out from where I sat. You've had it there for as long as I've been in that office. I don't think you notice it anymore, the way you noticed it when you put it there. That's what happens with things we keep close. I noticed it that night. I had been moving money for 14 months by then. The structure was clean. I had made sure of that. And I had told myself, the way you tell yourself things at 1 a.m, when the numbers behave, the way you've arranged them to behave, that the exposure was manageable. That I would correct it before anyone looked closely. That the window was still open. I looked at that photograph for a long time. I'm not going to tell you it made me stop. It didn't. I want to be precise about this because I think imprecision is its own kind of lie. I kept moving the money. I kept managing the exposure. I kept believing the window was open. But I also copied every relevant file onto your external drive that night. All of it. The real ledgers, the corrected accounts, the documentation I had restructured to make the discrepancy invisible. I copied it without a plan. I did not decide in advance what copying it meant or what I intended you to do with it. I only knew that someone should have the truth somewhere in a form that couldn't be altered, and that it should be you. I told myself it was insurance. That's the word I used. I'm using a different word now. I don't expect you to consider this a mitigation. It isn't one. The amount of money involved, the number of people affected, the length of time I sustained it. None of that changes because I left a copy of the evidence on your desk. I know that. What I want you to know, the reason I'm writing this, instead of letting Harold Kim's reconstruction stand as the only version of events, is that the decision to copy those files was not strategic. I was not protecting myself. If I had been protecting myself, I would have deleted everything and taken my chances. I was sitting alone in an office that you built, looking at a photograph of your son, and I copied the truth onto a drive and put it where you would find it eventually. I don't have a cleaner explanation than that. VC. James set the letter on the table. He sat with it for a moment, not reading it again, just looking at the single sheet of paper, Victor's even script filling less than 2/3 of the page. The room was quiet. From somewhere below the window came the sound of Mrs. Patterson's television. Through the floor, low and indistinct, a voice giving the weather for the weekend. Harold was watching him. You knew, James said. Not an accusation. A recalibration. I suspected the file placement wasn't accidental, Harold said. The forensic pattern was too clean in one direction and too deliberate in the other. But I didn't know this. He nodded at the letter. No one knew this. James looked at the photograph he kept in his mind of his Atlanta office, the desk, the lamp, the left side, where Marcus Jr. stood at 10 years old in front of the entrance to Piedmont Park, squinting into the sun. He had not thought about that photograph in 11 months. He had not been back to that office in 11 months. He picked up the letter. He folded it once along the natural crease and placed it back in the manila envelope. What happens to it now? He asked. It's part of the record, Harold said. Catherine's attorneys have a copy. The DA's office will receive one. It doesn't change the charges. It doesn't change the timeline. He paused. But it will be read. James nodded. He set the envelope on the table between them and put his hand flat on top of it, the way his father used to press both palms to the kitchen table to check whether the surface was still holding. It was. 3 months is enough time for a city to stop feeling like a place you're hiding in and start feeling like a place you live. James Whitfield understood this the way you understand most things that happen slowly, not as a revelation, but as a fact. You notice one afternoon when you're already halfway through it. He was on Auburn Avenue at 3 o'clock on a Wednesday, walking south from Jackson Street, and he was not thinking about where he was going. He was thinking about the buildings. Auburn Avenue, in the middle of a Wednesday afternoon, had the particular quality of a place that knows what it is. Not what it had been, though it had been many things, and the record of those things was written into the facades of the structures that had survived the brickwork above the storefronts, the cornices with their careful ornamentation, the proportions of the windows on the upper floors that told you someone had once stood in an architect's office and decided this block deserved the consideration you gave to something meant to last. It had also lost to things, whole sections where the buildings were gone and the lot sat open, or where something new had been built without memory of what came before. Auburn Avenue held both the survived and the lost with the same straight-faced composure because it had no other option. James had been walking for 40 minutes. He had started at Centennial Olympic Park, which he acknowledged to himself was probably not a coincidence, and moved east, without a fixed destination, which was new. In 11 months, almost every movement he had made in this city had been toward something specific. A meeting, a call, a document that needed signing. 40 minutes of walking with no fixed point of arrival was, by the standards of his recent life, an extravagance. He stopped in front of the Herndon building. Alonzo Herndon had been born into slavery in 1858 and died the wealthiest black man in Atlanta in 1927. He had built Atlanta Life Insurance Company in a period when the architecture of American finance was specifically designed to exclude the people it was built around. James knew this history, the way most people know the history of the places they inhabit, in outline correctly, without having felt it particularly. Standing in front of the building on a Wednesday afternoon, he felt it. Not because his situation resembled Herndon's. It didn't in any way that counted. James had been given more starting points than he could honestly number, and he had lost a company through a betrayal he hadn't seen coming, and those were real things. But they did not belong in the same sentence as what Alonzo Herndon had navigated to put a building on this street. James was clear about that. What he felt was something simpler. He felt the particular stubbornness of the thing, the decision embedded in the architecture, the refusal to build small, just because the available space for building had been made deliberately narrow. You built what you believed the work deserved. You built it in the materials and the proportions that said, this is meant to be here. And then you were gone, and the building remained, and people stood in front of it, a century later, not knowing your name, but feeling in the structure itself that you had not been apologetic about what you were making. His phone rang. Marcus Jr., he answered. Hey, his son's voice, easy, in the way it had become easy again over the past 3 months, the careful distance of Task 11, thawed by increments. Neither of them had formally acknowledged. Hey, you walking? James looked up at this Herndon building. Auburn Avenue. A short pause. Good neighborhood for thinking. I wasn't thinking, James said. I was looking at a building. Marcus made a sound that meant he understood this was the same thing. He had grown up watching his father look at structures the way other men looked at spreadsheets, at game film, at maps. James read buildings. Marcus had always found it slightly strange, and was finding it now less strange. I called because I have something to tell you, Marcus said. Nothing bad. I want to say that first. Okay. I talked to Sandra. A breath. She's been talking to some of the institutional investors, the ones who held through everything. There are 3 of them who want to have a conversation about what comes next. He paused. Not a negotiation, just a conversation. They wanted to know if you'd be open to it. James said nothing for a moment. Below him on the sidewalk, a woman walked past with 2 children, one in a stroller, one holding the stroller's frame. Both of them looking at something across the street with the total absorption of children who have found something worth looking at. The woman was talking on her phone, managing the stroller, with one hand moving at a pace that suggested she was late for something and had decided to be late without catastrophe. Tell them yes, James said. Yeah, yes. Marcus was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet, when he was making sure he'd heard correctly and didn't want to make a thing of double-checking. Okay, he said finally. I'll tell Sandra. Tell her thank you. Another pause, a smaller, warmer. She knows. They stayed on the line a moment, without speaking, which was something they hadn't been able to do 3 months ago. The silence had been too full then. Now, it was just silence. The ordinary kind, the kind that meant nothing needed filling. I'll call you this weekend, Marcus said. I'll be here. He put the phone in his pocket and looked back at the building. The afternoon light had moved while he was talking lower, now coming at the brickwork from a different angle, pulling out the variation in the red that you couldn't see head-on. The building looked different at 3:15 than it had at 3. It would look different again at 4. That was the thing about a building meant to last. It showed you something new every time you came back to it. You had to keep coming back to see all of it. James Whitfield turned south on Auburn Avenue and kept walking. He had owned 4 suits in the Gray family over the years. The first was a wool blend he bought in 1994, the year he incorporated his first company, a small electrical contracting firm in Midtown Detroit that lasted 3 years and taught him everything the business schools hadn't. The second was a charcoal he wore to his father's retirement dinner in 2003 when Robert Whitfield sat at the head of a table at a restaurant on Woodward Avenue and accepted a watch from his union local with the same quiet dignity he had brought to 41 years of work. The third was the one he lost in the liquidation. A Canali custom fitted the kind of gray that reads as authority in a boardroom without announcing itself. He had not missed it. The fourth was the running suit He had put it on at 5:30 on a Tuesday morning in the second week of November, standing in the Randolph Street room in the dark. And the difference between this morning and the morning 14 months ago, when he had first pulled it on in this same room, was not something he could have explained to anyone who asked. He could only have said the weight is different, not lighter, different. The kind of different that means you are carrying the same thing, but you have learned where to hold it. He went out into the Atlanta morning. The city at 5:30 in November ran colder than he'd expected when he first came here. He had learned its rhythms, the way you learn any place you stay, long enough to stop being a visitor. The particular quality of the air, before the sun cleared the buildings to the east. The way Randolph Street sounded different on weekdays than on weekends, the exact corner where the wind came off Ponce de Leon, in a way that made you adjust your pace, whether you meant to or not. He knew this neighborhood now. It knew him in the way neighborhoods know the people who move through them regularly, not by name, but by pattern. He ran south, past the bodega on this corner, where Mr. Osei unlocked the gate at precisely 6 and nodded at James each morning with the nod of a man who has decided that consistency is its own form of greeting. Past the stretch of Auburn Avenue, where the Herndon building caught the first light differently than it caught the afternoon light, harder, cleaner. The brickwork going almost copper, before the sun rose fully, and the color settled back into red. He did not stop. He had already stood in front of that building and understood what he needed to understand from it. Now, it was just a building on a street he ran past, which was its own kind of honor. He reached Centennial Olympic Park at 6:12. He did not stop at the bench. He ran through. The truck was parked on Andrew Young International, the generator running low and steady, the serving window up. James could smell the oil from half a block away, the particular clean heat of it plantain frites in the first batch of the morning, the smell that had become over 14 months, the smell of a day beginning correctly. Yvonne was at the window when he arrived. She looked at him the way she had looked at him every morning for the past 3 months, since the bench, since the 7 words, since the morning she had walked away and left the paper with him, which was to say, she looked at him the way you look at someone you have decided to know. Not performing familiarity, just familiar. He stopped at the window. She had the container ready. She always had the container ready. He had stopped finding this remarkable and started finding it simply true, which he understood was the way she intended it. He reached into the pocket of the gray running suit. He set something on the ledge. It was an envelope, letter-sized, unsealed. She looked at it. She did not pick it up. "What is this?" she said. "Open it later," he said. "It's not a check." She looked at him steadily. Yvonne Baptiste had a particular way of looking at people that made it clear she was not deciding whether to trust them. She had already made that decision, one way or the other. She was simply reading what was true. She had been reading people across a service window for 12 years. She was very good at it. "Then what is it?" James picked up the container. He looked at her for a moment. This woman who had kept a note in the back of a recipe book for 11 years, who had shown up early on a cold morning to see if the man in the gray suit was who she thought he was, who had walked away without her paper and let him sit with it because she understood that some things you had to be left alone to carry. "It's the name of a program," he said. "Workforce Development. Renewable Energy Sector Entry-Level Certification, Paid Apprenticeships. Atlanta Public Schools Partnership. We're launching the pilot in March." He paused. "I need someone who knows how to feed people while they're learning something hard." Yvonne was quiet for a moment. "Catering," she said. Among other things, she looked at the envelope. She looked at him. Something moved in her face. Not surprise, because Yvonne Baptiste had stopped being surprised by what people were capable of when they had been through enough to find out, but recognition. The kind that means yes. This is the shape of it. This is what it was always going to look like. "I'll read it tonight," she said. "Take your time." She picked up the envelope and set it on the shelf behind her, next to the recipe book with the worn cover that he didn't know was there, and she had never mentioned. She turned back to the window. "Same time tomorrow," she said. "Same time tomorrow," he said. He ran. The Atlanta morning opened ahead of him, the sky going from gray to pale gold, above the buildings on Peachtree, the city assembling itself out of darkness, the way it did every morning, indifferent to whether any particular person was ready for it, moving forward, because forward was the only direction it knew. James Whitfield ran through it in a gray suit, at a pace he had learned over 14 months of not stopping left foot, landing a half-second longer than the right. There are people in your life who appear at the exact moment the ground gives way beneath you. Not to catch you. The falling is yours to do, but to be there when you come back up with something warm and real to offer, because they once learned in their own falling what it means to need exactly that. If you know someone like that, you already know what to do.